Welcome, everybody. I wanted to just say a quick word of welcome to all of you. By way of background, this series is inspired by really what got us started was Dean Nathan's sermon following the awful events of January 6th, in which he discussed the rise of Christian nationalism and his own personal story behind kind of the roots of that. And then shortly after that was a wonderfully compelling op-ed piece in the New York Times that discussed this. And then I reached out to Nathan. I said, I think we should do a little 9 o'clock forum on this topic. It's important. And I looked into the author of that op-ed piece in the Times, and it turned out to be the author of this book. And then Nathan said, well, you know, we should be taking a look at this Jeanne Kaliszewski, because she's just posted the same piece on her Facebook page and linked it to the whole conversation around Pelagianism, which was a very interesting take on the same subject, going right to our very roots as a Christian community. So I reached out to Jeanne, and she was gracious enough to say yes to the invitation. And here we are. As Jeanne said, this has been kind of quickly put together. I'm really grateful to Jeanne for being willing to step up to the plate, order a book and inhale it in a few days and be prepared to talk to us about it. So thank you, Jeanne, for being willing to do that. And I hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for being here. I recognize a few folks, either from my home parish of Grace, where I serve right now, or other sort of diocesan events and things. I'm really delighted to have y'all here. And yeah, this is a quick response to what happened on January 6th. And I read Nathan's letter or blog post to Trinity. I have not heard his sermon. I do not have the sort of personal connection to this topic that I know Nathan does and a few of my friends do, but I became interested in what was happening. And as Matthew said, I posted on Facebook, and that teaches me to post anything on Facebook because here I am. So I'm delighted to be here with you all this morning. I do want to put your mind at ease because this is such a quick response to what happened. Please don't feel like you were supposed to have read this book, even part of this book. Maybe you don't even have the book yet. Totally fine. I'm going to do a little brief introduction, kind of summarize the first, I'm thinking 4 chapters, maybe the 5th chapter, but I think the 4th chapter is kind of a good break. And then in the subsequent meetings, we'll address and discuss kind of the 2nd third and the 3rd third of the book. And also, as we go along, I'd like to try to bring in some other voices and other things that I've read that I think might be pertinent to this conversation. So that being said, I'd like to just open us in prayer, and then we will get going. And just as way of introduction before we pray, I'm Jeanne Kaliszewski. I am a curate at Grace Memorial Episcopal Church, which is in the Lloyd Center area in Portland. And I have known Nathan for quite a long time, and Matthew, and they invited me to lead this conversation. And I'm delighted to be here with the good people of Trinity and a few folks from Grace who are joining us as well. So I'm going to pray us in with the Collect for Social Justice from the Book of Common Prayer. So the Lord be with you. Almighty God, who created us in your own image, grant us grace fearlessly to contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, and that we may reverently use our freedom. Help us to employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of your holy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. I feel like I'm learning a lot. It's sort of a crash course in me reconsidering some of the assumptions I have had around this question of the right, the new right, and the role in which the Evangelical Church and the sort of more conservative flavors of Christianity have played in what has been happening politically in our country. I'll just share a brief story that I think a couple of years ago, my daughter was getting ready to leave for college, and she found out who her roommate was. She was a senior in high school, and her roommate was assigned. And her roommate came from, I think, outside of Nashville in Tennessee. Lovely young woman. I just want to say that up front. Really great young woman. And my daughter was reading her bio and, the sort of stuff that she had said. And my daughter said, Mom, I think she's a Christian. And I was kind of like, well, yeah, right? Your mom's a priest. You remember that? You've been baptized. I don't really know what to say. And she goes, no. You know what I mean? She's a Christian. And so I did know what she meant, that she assumed that she was a much more conservative sort of Christian. And when I had that conversation with her, I think I just sort of assumed that this was a PR problem for us in the Episcopal Church, right? That we're sort of losing the PR battle in terms of what it means to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus, and that now in our country, Christian is kind of almost, immediately associated with much more fundamental conservative flavors of following Jesus. I think what at least I have come to realize over the past week or two, and even a little bit before that, is that this is much more than a PR problem, right? This is a fundamental worldview difference that is not just a worldview difference around values or theology, but also the ways in which Christians are engaged in the struggle around politics and power and money. And so I think that that's really what this book is kind of outlining for me as I read through it, is that where I assumed we had certainly theological differences, differences around values, especially values around abortion, sexuality, certainly around racial justice to a certain extent, although I think that was a little less obvious at the beginning. I assumed these were theological and value differences, but really what became clear to me in reading this book is it runs much deeper, that in some ways the values conversations, the theology conversations mask a deeper desire for power and also stem a lot from money as well. And so I think that is what the author of this book, Katherine Stewart, who also penned that op-ed about Josh Hawley, which is kind of what started this conversation, is pointing to in looking at the roots of Christian nationalism in the United States and the ways in which it's really co-opted in many ways, I think, the Republican Party in this country, and really found a way to insinuate itself in the halls of power of our country. So that's just sort of a general introduction to what I've been taking away from this book thus far. And just so everyone knows, I mean, the plan for this conversation is I'm going to talk myself for about 10 more minutes, and then I'd like to invite a conversation, comments, thoughts, what have you, questions from this group. It's a big group, and so probably what we'll do is, does everyone know how to use the raise hand function? After I'm done talking, you can either wave at me, although I can't get everybody on my screen. You can wave at me or do the raise hand function, the participants bar, and then we'll try to have a little more of an open conversation, questions. You can also add things into the chat if you prefer, and we can kind of do it that way. So what's interesting about this book is that the author really is a journalist, right? So she's not approaching this as a believer, as a Christian, as we might in terms of what, and at the beginning of this book, I was a little frustrated about that. I'm like, well, I want to know, from a sort of maybe more progressive side of Christianity, how I engage in this in this conversation. And what I'm realizing is she's really laying out the nature of the rise of Christian nationalism, the ways in which it is active in public life. But I think that really what I hope is by the end of this 3-week forum, that we as a group or we as individuals will begin to understand how we might engage going forward, encountering not only the narrative of Christian nationalism, but also how we might engage more fully in some of the issues that she raises. So just a couple overall themes that I wanted to sort of talk about before I break down into kind of what each chapter was about. I saw a few things that she highlighted that I wanted to just sort of raise up. I think the first I just mentioned that whereas I think that, at least for me, I have tended to think about differences between more progressive mainline Christianity and the rise of the Christian right, evangelical churches, the new right. She gives it a lot of different names in this. I had assumed that these were differences around theology, which they are. They certainly are differences around theology. But I think I sort of, beyond the theology, I really thought it was primarily an issue around values, and honestly, mostly around abortion. That was my sort of take on the 2016 election, that really that there's a significant block of voters who care only about abortion as their sort of primary and only voting issue. And so I had sort of assumed that was it, right? And what the author of this book outlines is that actually abortion, certainly I think for many people in many churches, is an absolute moral question. Is something that they vote on from a moral and theological place. So I just want to name that. But the way the author outlines this is that the leaders of the movement, the Christian nationalist movement, saw abortion as an opportunity to serve as a wedge issue in the political sphere, and noted that questions around abortion as a political issue did not come up until about 6 or 7 years after Roe v. Wade became the law of the land. And so I think that the author points to this not only around the issue of abortion, but also around the issue of sexuality, right? And that that is another area in which, again, I assumed, and our church has been through this, and we've had our own, issues around, as we became open and affirming, as we embraced marriage equality, ordaining Jeanne Robinson. There were wrestlings within our own tradition around these questions. And again, I think I assumed that was kind of it. But sexuality seems to be, again, another one of those wedge issues that the Christian right can talk about in church, but is hiding underneath it a lot of other things going on in terms of a drive for power and a drive for money. So those are a couple things that I noticed in that. The second theme that I see coming up again and again is the question of the role of the Bible and the role of the interpretation of the Bible in our own tradition and in the Christian nationalist sort of circles, right? There's a fair bit in the first couple chapters about the role that Bible studies play in Washington, D.C. In fact, right? There are groups of leaders in the Christian nationalist movement who hold Bible studies who were holding Bible studies with members of President Trump's cabinet, and sort of using Bible studies as a way to, again, insert themselves into the places where power and policy are being made. And one of the things I was reflecting on as I thought about the role of the Bible in our own tradition and in the sort of more conservative Christian right churches and circles was a talk I heard from Walter Brueggemann. And I don't know, y'all know Walter Brueggemann. He's a Old Testament scholar, a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful guy. And he was talking about the role of the Bible in the sort of Christian evangelical world and in the mainline church. And the way he phrased it, and this was very provocative to me, and I just like to sort of name this, and this might be something we come back to later, is that in more conservative Christian churches, the approach to the Bible has not gotten to the sort of historical critical scholarship that is basically very fundamental to the way we think about the Bible in the mainline church, right? And so there is a sense of the Bible is true. It's not necessarily an inerrancy, but it's not a contextualization of the Bible within the historical context, the social context, the cultural context in which it was written, right? And so questions around sexuality, around gender, there's a fair bit of discussion around traditional values around marriage and the role of women in marriage and that sort of thing, are really taken sort of whole cloth from the text itself without any sort of critical view as to whether or not we might consider the social, cultural, and historical context in which these texts were written. Brueggemann contends kind of provocatively, and I'd just like to throw this out here as something for you all to think about, is that in the mainline church, we're really struggling to get past the historical critical phase, right? So we spend a lot of time talking about the context and the historical context, the social context, the cultural context, the political context of the Bible, but we need to kind of move to what the next step is, which is a post-historical critical stance, which is, well, what truths are we gleaning from this, right? So we can recognize the context in which it was created, but then move into a new phase in which we are, in the words of one friend of mine, not everything in the Bible happened, but everything is true, right? Like where do we find truth? Where do we find values? Where do we find a theology that we can accept the historical critical context in which the Bible was created and then move into something deeper? For example, my daughter was taking a New Testament class in college, and when I was preparing my Easter sermon, she just was adamant. She goes, Mom, you know there are no eyewitnesses to what happened with Jesus. You know that, right? And I was like, yes, I do, right? But for her, that was that was it. She was stopping there, right? And so I was trying to have a conversation with her. It's like, yes, I can accept that as true and also believe the truth of what is being expressed in these texts, even though we don't have any eyewitnesses that can attest to it. So that's the kind of conversation Brueggemann is talking about in the role of the Bible. I would like to also just sort of draw your attention to the question of education. And one theme that the author talks about again and again is the role of schools, not only private schools and Christian schools, but also homeschooling as a way in which there is a lot of curriculum and a educational stance that frames the founding of the United States as a Christian nation, that reframes the ways in which democracy is meant to work. And while I certainly think that the founders of our country, there were a lot of problems with how our country was founded and some of the theology and some of the ways in which that our Constitution and the country was started, there is a reframing within the educational sphere of what it is meant, what this country is about. I mean, I think we could see that even just today in the 1776 document that was up and down very quickly on the Trump website that was meant to be a counter to the 1619 document that came out of the New York Times that was really reframing the role of slavery in this country and the role of basically Christianity in the founding of this country. And I think that that's a big theme that the author brings up as well. And then finally, there's just the question of money. And, you know, I was stunned at one point, the author said that one of the leaders of the Christian right said that the gospel is pro-private property. Right. And so the ways in which the Bible is being used to reinforce a sort of capitalist worldview, a worldview that honestly protects the wealth of very few individuals, and also the ways in which money has played into the rise of this movement. Again and again, the author points to a handful of very wealthy donors, including the DeVos family, which again, I didn't know that Betsy DeVos was sort of part of that world, that are bankrolling a fair bit of this work. And so these are wealthy families who agree with the sort of worldview, and probably in part because they benefit from it, and that therefore they are bankrolling a lot of the sort of political work that's happening in the halls of Congress and throughout the country as this Christian nationalist sort of program continues to go. Bye, Matthew. Thank you for coming. There is a comment. I was going to actually name this, and I thank you for that, Kimberly, that the Netflix series Mrs. America is wonderful. And if y'all haven't seen it, that actually does sort of dramatize the rise of the Christian right as a political force in the United States. Phyllis Schlafly is a member of, was the sort of found her political footing in the anti-ERA movement. And so it outlines the anti-ERA movement and the ways in which she engaged in the question of abortion as a way of building a coalition around the anti-ERA movement with more conservative religious folks in the political sphere. So, okay, thank you. There's a comment. I'm uncomfortable with the term sexuality as a way to address LGBTQ. Research is clear that sex is no more or less important in gay people's relationship than it is in heterosexuals. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I will reframe my language and say it's not a question of sexuality. It's a question of LGBTQ issues, rights, identity, and I apologize for using that shorthand, and I agree that there's a much more comprehensive way of thinking about the way these things have been played out. And you're right. I mean, when I use the shorthand of the term sexuality, I'm actually playing into, in some ways, allowing more conservative folks to frame the narrative. I think it was the 4th chapter in the book profiles a man named Jim Donan, I think, who is sort of become to power in part because he has reflected on his life as a gay man, claimed that he has sort of conquered his sexuality and put it only in terms of sex. And so you're absolutely right. When we only talk about sexuality, I think we're also playing into sort of allowing more conservative folks to frame the narrative that it really is only an issue about sex. So I thank you for naming that, and I will try to be more careful in the language that I use. Gosh, I've talked a long time. I'm wondering, rather than sort of, summarize each chapter sort of follows individual organizations and folks as they sort of navigate and the ways in which political relationships have been built by these different organizations. And I will say one other thing that I noticed in this, and then I'll stop talking and maybe we can have a little bit of conversation, is the ways in which there's really absolutely no compunction on the far Christian right to be explicitly political. And I know as a clergy person in our denomination, I have heard time and again about the ways in which we are not allowed to bring sort of explicit politics into the pulpit. I can't get up into the pulpit and endorse a person or a party. I was struck by the fact that really is not an issue for the other side, right? And although there is a sort of attempt to at least pretend that they're not endorsing or give the appearance that they're not endorsing a specific political party or policy or person. At one point in the book, the author states that she really felt that, or I think she's quoting someone, that honestly, there's more of a political litmus test in some of these churches than there is a theological one, right? And so what brings folks together is really more about what party they're voting for and the way that they're voting versus a sort of theological commitment to a certain worldview, which I thought was very interesting. And again, I think that I don't really have, I'm not saying that we should just go out and start claiming things in the pulpit. I'm just saying it's an interesting difference in sort of worldview in terms of how this far-right movement has built connections and steam in the United States. So, okay, I'm going to stop talking right now. I'm wondering if, I'm going to pull up the participants tab. I'm wondering if anyone who has read into the book or just really been thinking about this question has any comments or questions that they'd like to pose at this point.
Hi, I'm Marty from Trinity. And when you were talking about your daughter, that's exactly what has made me think about this issue so much. My kids are 36, 38, 39, no, 40. And as my gay son, who's 37, says, I hate Christians, but I love Trinity. And I would say we need to get our heads around this issue, or I don't think we're going to have any new members under 40. Because I think Christians really have a branding issue as too narrow, and you don't like my gay son, and you know.
So do you think your son doesn't see Trinity as Christian, or it's just an exception? It's like an
exception.
Okay, a small
because
pocket.
He was raised there, you know, spent every holiday there, and Nathan's there. Nathan's his age, and it's like, man, Trinity is it's not the normal church when I go out in the world.
Right.
And
right.
people
Absolutely.
that say they're Christian, I don't want to be around them.
Absolutely.
And he's like, Mom, I don't mean anything, you know, Trinity's fine, but like.
Absolutely. So there was a comment a little bit earlier, I'll just say in the chat, Barbara said, what discourages her is that the issue is less religious beliefs and more power mongering under the guise of religion. I actually think you're absolutely right. I think that's the theme that the author keeps bringing out. Although I would say, and I just wonder about this, I think certainly I've been sort of wrestling with this in the book. I think certainly among the leadership of these organizations, there seems to be that sort of guise of religion, or sort of warping the scriptures towards their ends. I wonder if in the pews, right, in many of these churches, if people understand that. And that's one question I had, because the author's really addressing the sort of systemic issue in the leadership, but I'm wondering about that. Craig asks, I wonder how many people here were raised in this. At Trinity, we have more than a few converts from evangelicalism. So wondering about that. I don't know if people feel comfortable sharing that. I can see a few hands being raised. Yeah, right. And that's something, Alan, a little bit further below, I was going to share that later, Alan, and I appreciate you sharing it. Shared the House of Deputies, President Gay Clark Jennings issued a statement around Christian nationalism. And one of the things that she put in there is that we are actually called to sort of be, I think the term was off-ramp, right? To folks who feel called to leave this brand of Christianity and the way in which it has been functioning, and that is one role that our church might play in this conversation, as being a welcoming place for folks who really cannot, who are done with the theology and the ways in which that their church has been active in this area. Beth says, we definitely have a branding problem. I cringe at being called white Christian when in fact that is what I am, but I am not a political white Christian. Okay, that's an interesting distinction, so thank you. Jeffrey Cresswell says, the Episcopal Church has been careful about not endorsing political points of view or candidates, but I believe we are at a time in history where we can't afford to sit back and not address the critical issues of our day. And often these issues divide along political lines in our polarized environment. You know, thank you, Jeffrey. And I actually just wanted to add something I've been thinking about, and I'll put a link to this blog post I found. But I've been thinking about the fact that I wonder if I'd be Christian if it weren't actually for Christian nationalism, right? So in the year 312, Constantine had a vision on the battlefield of Christ, and he converted, he won his battle. And in the year 313, the Edict of Milan was issued, in which Christianity was sort of made the sort of public religion, right? I will make the argument that many of us would not, I'm not even sure Christianity would still be around if it weren't for Constantine, right? So that's a thing that I want to wrestle with as we continue this conversation, not just, oh my gosh, look what they're doing on that side, but the ways in which our own religion and tradition in history and even today has or has not been participating in this kind of role. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of name that, but I think that that's a really good question. Is how do we? I know I have many clergy friends who, if they're preaching a strong social justice word, maybe out of the gospel text, inevitably any sort of critical response they get is, oh, don't be too political, right? And so being political has become almost like the reverse bludgeon in some ways, I think, within our own denomination, that people are so concerned with being branded political that maybe we are not stepping into some hard conversations like we might otherwise. Kimberly says, I don't say Christian when talking about the far right. I say those who have been touched by the evangelical movement. That is my shorthand, but I might be the only one as to not give Christian in the title, or if we all say Christian nationalism. That's a really interesting thought. Do we even want to label this as Christian? And Madeline Lingle said she was not a Christian writer, but a writer who happened to be a Christian. And Robert Rose talked about the sort of off-ramp. And then Keith shared a documentary from German TV on how U.S. Christian nationalism plays out in the pews in 3 southern towns. Thank you for that. And then Madeline asked, is there an intersection between predominantly Black churches and Christian evangelical nationalism? That's a really good question. The 4th chapter in this book talks a little bit about the ways in which this movement has been broadening itself racially. Certainly, the author seems to make the argument that the stronghold, the genesis of this movement really is kind of maybe out of Southern churches, although she does make the point that, for example, and this is where these denominational questions get complicated. After Roe v. Wade became the law of the land, the Baptist Church supported Roe v. Wade for a number of years, right? And she talked a little bit about, I think it was called steeple stealing. I don't remember what she talked about, but she talked about how there was actually a concerted effort for more right-wing churchgoers to actually infiltrate a little more liberal churches to try to sort of take over for their worldview. The author in the 4th chapter talks specifically about outreach to Latinx congregations, noting, again, I think this is where this question about values gets a little more complicated, because I think in reaching out to Latino and Latin, more conservative Latino and Latinx congregations, there is a question around values that is at play, right? And so this guy, I think his name is Jim Donan, don't quote me on that, is working in California and is reaching out specifically to try to broaden the racial diversity of the movement. So I think traditionally there's been issues around of it being primarily a white movement. Chapter 5, which we'll talk about a little bit more next week, the author traces some of the theology. There's a theology called Christian Reconstructionism that she traces actually back to slavery and to theologians that were writing during the Civil War and Reconstruction as pro-slavery theologians who were saying that this was an institution ordained by God, and that theology is operative in the sort of intellectual history of this movement. So the author doesn't really talk about Black churches per se, Madeline, but there is, it does seem to be an effort to sort of outreach to broaden the racial profile of the movement. Okay, so there's a question about sexuality and asked, sexuality involves love and touch and other, what do you think? Also, there is a link between mainline and other more progressive Christianity. It seems that the mainline Christianity has been decidedly sidelined in current society. Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question, right? I think that there are, not just around LGBTQ. I think that there are issues around women's ordination, for example, right? And the role of women in the church that are explicitly questions that are part of this conversation. The author makes the point that there's sort of a muscular, hyper-masculine sort of identity that goes with this movement. I think you can see that, honestly, in our former president. I see that in folks like Josh Hawley, that there's this sort of, even, the former vice president, and the ways in which he talked about not wanting to be in the room with women other than his wife. There is a sort of way in which gender plays into this that is absolutely part of that conversation as well. Barbara said she finds it harder to come out as a Christian than as a lesbian, mostly because of the distortions within Christianity. My friends are horrified to learn that I'm going to church. Again, I think this speaks to the ways in which the word Christian has been, or the term Christian has been co-opted in a lot of ways in the public sphere around this issue. So Karen said she started reading the conservative press after the 2016 election. God bless you. She realized she was in a bubble. I highly recommend David French, who writes for a new publication called The Dispatch, who's been thinking brilliantly and critically and passionately about evangelicalism. He is one and traces much of the shame honor culture to the South. I would also name a really great loss, which was Rachel Held Evans was another voice who was speaking into this place. I mean, I think, honestly, friends, it's as delighted as I am to have this conversation, I think that this raises a point that actually, in some ways, former people who come out of this world can speak to this in a language that is a little more foreign to those of us who were maybe raised in the Episcopal Church. I think Rachel Held Evans had an incredible gift for being able to go into these conversations with someone who was steeped in this culture, in this education, in this way of viewing Christianity, who Rachel Held Evans was an Episcopalian at the end of her life, and was able to sort of have that conversation in a way that spoke directly to the ways in which that conversation is happening in the evangelical world. And so again, I think that points to the importance of our denomination as offering a space for people to come into when they are ready to maybe enter a different kind of Christian space, as Rachel Held Evans did. Kimberly says, when I teach, for Constantine, use religion to solidify his power over the state, use Christianity as a way to maintain order. Jump forward to 39 years, the war of 17th century was the guise of Catholicism became a bludgeon to bring wayward countries back. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's actually a really good point. And I think that that's the thing that we need to, at least for me, I'll speak for myself. I find it helpful to not get too much on my high horse about this, right? So I think it's helpful for me to recognize the way in which our own history and denomination have played this game in the past. It was not too long ago that the Episcopal Church was the sort of state church. What have we claim more presidents than any other denomination, although there wasn't an overt presence like the one that the author describes. I think that that's an important thing to raise, and something that I've thought about many, many times is, what does it mean to lean into that, right? As a denomination, to lean into the fact that we do have members of our denomination who, at least historically, have been in the halls of power. Okay, for example, like, I'm sorry, this might be a little too, but Tucker Carlson is an Episcopalian, right? So what the heck, right? What's happening in our Episcopal Church that's the case, right? How are we forming Christians within our own denomination that we can end up in a space where, or I think Judge Gorsuch is also an Episcopalian, right? And so there are Episcopalians in the world. The other person we were talking about the other day was Senator Danforth from Minnesota. So Senator Danforth is an Episcopal priest who actually was the mentor of Josh Hawley, the political mentor of Josh Hawley. And although Senator Danforth has now come out and said, that was the biggest mistake of his life and he really regrets it, it actually does speak to the ways in which we are forming disciples, forming folks in our denomination. And again, I don't want to say that I think we pride ourselves in sort of this middle way as being, an open church. I just think it gives me something to think about in this conversation. And then Anne said she read this book and was startled to find that the Christian supporting Vladimir Putin because he was supporting the Russian Orthodox Church and was against gay and LGBT people. And again, I think that's, I'll point back to the earlier comment about Mrs. America. They actually point to that as an interesting sort of intersection around different forms of Christianity. Phyllis Schlafly was a Roman Catholic, right? And saw abortion as a way to bridge relationships with not just evangelicals, but conservative Catholics, conservative Jews, Mormons, in that way, again, that was a way that folks could kind of look past their theological or denominational differences and come together around one issue in particular. Colleen asked, when you said there are no witnesses to what happened to Jesus Christ, you mean the resurrection? What my daughter was saying was none of the books in the Bible were written by eyewitnesses, right? Or that was her argument to me. And so how can I believe in the resurrection? And again, I think that's just taking a very 21st century view of what it means to believe something, what it means to have proof. And we can have another conversation about that. She's also 20, so she likes nothing more than to poke at her Episcopal priest mom. So I'll just name that. But I don't want to give you too much insight into my relationship with my daughter. But yes, and the conversation must not become an us and them conversation. We're all swimming in the same complex suit, including us Episcopalians. Absolutely. And I thank you for naming that. That's absolutely right. And I think that again, I think when we what this author is doing is raising at least my understanding of what the stakes are, right? And the stakes are high. We saw that on January 6th. And I will just name, as we're closing out, the author talks about two different forms of theology that are at work in this movement. One I mentioned earlier, it's called Christian Reconstructionism, and she goes more into that in the 5th chapter. And then she also talks about this notion of dominionism. And that is a theology that basically says that Christians should take over the 7 mountains of American culture, which include entertainment, politics, media, these sort of different areas. And so there's a really fundamental different sort of theology at work. And I would encourage y'all, as you continue to read this book, to kind of pay attention to that. I'll read a couple more comments and then maybe we'll just sort of wrap things up because we all have church at 10. Keith says, having been raised a Southern Baptist in a small Southern town in the 50s and 60s, I can easily imagine the grieving some of those folks are experiencing now. Yeah. Much as early Christ believers were sure the parousia would occur momentarily, these folks were sure Trump would be reelected, and some continue to believe that by some miracle he will be reinstated in the coming weeks. I wonder what these clergy are telling their congregations today. And I appreciate that because I think it also names something that I would like to leave us with as we continue this conversation is this morning I'm preaching at Grace, and one of the things I'm preaching about is repentance, right? And we have an interesting juxtaposition of text today. We have this little bit from Jonah, and Jonah literally ran away from God because Jonah could not handle that God would offer love and forgiveness to the people that Jonah hates, right? Jonah was just like, I can't even. Jonah understood the nature of God and was like, I can't do that, and turned his back on God and literally ran away, right? I just want to leave that there, right? That as Christians, this notion of grace, this notion of repentance, and it's not an easy, cheap grace in the words of Bonhoeffer. I mean, I think we have to be clear about that, but I think this idea of where does our theology land? How do we read the scriptures in a way that allows us to remain compassionate, to have empathy, to be a place of love, and yet also recognize that there's a lot of destruction and pain and a lot of bad theology that kills out there, and that we are called to speak up out of a place of love and name those things when we find them. And then Barbara said her minimal reading of this book has brought to her attention that religion is the vehicle that the power mongers are using to legitimize the power struggle. I appreciate the title, Power Worshippers. Absolutely. And I think next week we'll talk a little bit more about the history of this movement, continue conversation, and the ways in which I think Nathan named in his blog post, it's really, I will say, idolatrous, right? That what is being worshipped is not God, but power, right? And how do we name that in a way that actually calls it out, and then offer another way of considering the ways in which we follow God and can still participate in this conversation. So I talked a lot. Thank you all. I appreciate you being here. Next week, let's just kind of roughly, maybe if you could read up to the second third of the book. And sure, the title and the author of the book, please. Yes, it is The Power Worshippers. Could someone maybe write it in the chat? The Power Worshippers by Katherine Stewart. Yeah, and I really appreciate y'all spending this your pre-church time with me. Blessings on your week, and I look forward to seeing you next week as we continue the conversation. Be well, friends.